Hi, welcome to the second installment of the Uppsala International Hub podcast series. My name is Holly Guthrie and I work as the project leader with Uppsala International Hub. And today's topic is going to be finding your new home in Sweden. So, as we know, this is one of the first important aspects that one needs to deal with when moving to a new city. So, we have with us Yun-Chen Sun, who is a doctoral candidate at Uppsala University, and Yun-Chen has been living here since 2014. Also myself, so we have quite a vast array of housing
experience.
Yeah, that's a kind word.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. So, Yun-Chen, let's take it away.
Yes. So, as Holly said, it's very important for anyone essentially who wants to move to a new city. And I think in Uppsala, for us internationals, what to consider first is if we want to rent or if we want to buy an apartment. But I think in most cases, renting is much easier, and that's what we're gonna talk about.
Yeah.
More in this podcast episode. And a second consideration, I think, is if internationals, if we are moving just by ourselves or if we're moving with our family members, then we might look for either a smaller or bigger apartment, and that will make also a difference in the apartment hunting process.
That makes a lot of sense. And also, I mean, often people with families, at least my friends, seem to be willing to live a bit further outside of town, to be closer to nature and that sort of thing. So sometimes that can make renting an apartment even easier if you're willing to live a little further outside of town, for example.
Exactly.
Is that how you've experienced it?
Yeah, exactly.
So, Yun-Chen, why don't we start? I mean, tell me what your living situation is and sort of how did you get into the living situation that you have now?
Yeah, so currently I am living in a student apartment because in Uppsala, PhD study counts as a university student in terms of getting a housing. So for me, I got an apartment after around 6 years of queuing at this agency called Uppsala Bostadsförmedling.
Okay.
And after that, it is a first-hand apartment, and it's around 40 square meters. Yeah.
And what do you mean by first-hand apartment?
So that I have this contract with my name, and I have it with the landlord, which in my case is Uppsalahem.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is something maybe interesting to talk about a little bit more, the first-hand versus second-hand and the queuing process, which
exactly.
I have found very unique here.
Yeah.
So what's sort of, do you know the rationale behind that or sort of how the queue process came to be or I mean, do you have any insights on that?
If you are looking for a place in Uppsala or anywhere in Sweden, there are some agencies or websites that serve as some sort of aggregator of the say the rental market, and you can apply to be in the queue. Sometimes it's for free, and sometimes you have to pay a yearly fee. Then what happens is that you can search for the type of apartments that you want, and you can see the requirements to get such apartments. And for most cases, and very unfortunately, it might take quite a few years in order to get a first-hand contract through such housing queues.
I mean, I'm from the US, from Texas, and you look on a website, you see an apartment, and you rent an apartment.
Yeah.
It just happens.
Right.
Whereas here, as you mentioned, I mean, it can take quite a long time. And I mean, my sort of interpretation of that queue system is part of the kind of democratic norms of Sweden that it's in place in a way to sort of equalize everyone, that
Yeah.
if you come into the queue, then everyone has the same opportunity to get an apartment. But at the same time, it can be difficult for those that are coming in and have not been in the queue since birth or since they're 16 or what have you. And I also wanted to just follow up a little bit on, you had mentioned a minute ago Uppsala bostadsförmedlingen.
Yeah.
And so can you tell me a little bit more about what that is and sort of how one interacts with that system?
Exactly. So in English, we can say it's about an housing agency for Uppsala region.
Right.
Meaning it covers not only the city of Uppsala, but also some other cities in the Uppsala province or the Uppsala region. And
so you basically have everything from kind of city center to maybe the municipalities outside, like Håbo and Knivsta. So all of those are in Köping.
Yeah.
So all of those are covered in that. Is that
exactly? Yeah, exactly. And one doesn't need to have a Swedish personal number to register.
This is something that many people seem to not know, actually. Whereas I think the biggest tip that I have in terms of searching for an apartment before you arrive, if you have any sort of what would you say, sort of a period before you're going to arrive, whether it's 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, whatever, as soon as you know that you're moving, sign up for the queue.
Exactly.
And even if you can't search for apartments or you can't get offers for apartments without the personal number, you are still accruing time in the queue.
Yeah.
So the clock starts ticking from day one that you pay the fee. So I think that's something that at least I have seen that actually I didn't know about this until pretty recently. So.
Yeah.
And then, did you have any experience with Uppsala University Housing Office? Did you have an apartment through them beforehand?
Yeah. So if you are a master student, a PhD student, or if you are a visiting researcher, Uppsala Housing Office, which is under Uppsala University, might be able to offer you short-term options. There are many furnished apartments in the city of Uppsala, and many of them are pretty central as well. So you can look at their website, and there are usually very specific criteria and very specific procedures that you need to do in order to get one.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, do you have anything that you would recommend to these, I mean, not just students, but those even researchers or anyone, any international who's moving to Uppsala this fall, who's coming into this situation with really kind of extra high pressure and demand to find housing? Do you have any recommendations for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the very first thing they need to do is to check with their employers and see if they have either some sort of relocation support, or if they have contacts with some private housing agencies in Uppsala or in Uppsala region, and if their future colleagues have contacts that are renting out. I think that's always the first thing to do, to check immediately with the employer and see if there are options available.
I've suggested this to people before as well, to send an email to your HR person or whoever sends out sort of, your email blasts to the department or whatever, with information of, okay, my name's Holly, I'm looking for an apartment. Does anyone know of anything? And I mean, I've had success with that previously when I worked at the university, so sometimes that can definitely work. I think another tip that I thought about while you were speaking was, it's not as ideal, obviously, but there are a number of long-stay hotels that are also in Uppsala. I don't know if you've come into much contact with those, but...
I personally haven't, but I know that there are a few of them in Uppsala, and I think they are charged by weeks or months, right?
I think you can do, yeah, you can sort of choose, and it
Right.
depends a bit on the length of stay.
Yeah.
But I know there's one that's Academy Hotellet, which is
Alright.
pretty close to the academic hotel, if you
Mhm.
will, which is pretty close to the main university building. And then there's also Eklundshof,
Mhm.
which is a little bit further out of town on the river, but I know
Right.
they have long stay
Mm.
properties as well. So if one really gets in desperate times, you know, that can be an option as
That
well.
can be an option as well. Yeah.
And I mean, I wonder, would you think it was worth suggesting to an employer, for example, if you really can't find a first-hand place, if maybe we can work out some kind of a cost sharing or something like
Absolutely.
that?
I think because this is a concern for many actually, especially if they're moving here with their family members, then they really have to find a place.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that even before coming to Uppsala, I think that's something that needs to be dealt with. Yeah. And if our internationals cannot find anything before they arrive, they really have to inform their employer and see if there are other options, maybe to pay for like a hotel stay for a month, maybe as like a temporary solution at least. That type of offers, yes. Yeah.
And it is really hard to, before you arrive, to know sort of what's available
Exactly.
and all that sort of thing. And you don't have a network here yet.
Yep.
So I think it's really difficult to sort of know who to reach out to.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, this is also, I don't know if you've come into firsthand contact with this either, but one kind of quirky thing about the housing market here that I've seen on Uppsala Bostadsförmedlingen apartments, for example, is that there are many times that you actually cannot go to a viewing, even if you are in Uppsala, or also that there aren't photos available
Right.
of the apartment, which some internationals that I've dealt with are like, wait, hold on, like, what's going on here?
Right,
like,
right. Yeah.
But you know, I mean, it took me 4.5 years on Uppsala Bostadsförmedlingen to get my first-hand apartment, and I rented that without seeing it. It was a newly produced apartment or newly built apartment, and had no idea. I turned up the first day and was like, oh, okay, this is what it looks like.
Yeah. Sometimes you just need to take a leap of faith.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, I normally suggest that to people that, you know, even if it feels strange, as long as you're renting a first-hand apartment from a rental company, and you see the floor plan and that it's, you know, mediated through Uppsala Bostadsförmedlingen, then it's okay to rent an apartment without seeing it.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the second-hand market, that's a different story,
That's
right?
a very different story because usually for second-hand options, that's actually more common for newly arrived internationals, and there will be more. One needs to be more careful essentially with that as well, because you are not signing essentially with a rental company. You are signing with a private, most likely a private individual. And that will change how you process everything.
So what does one need to keep in mind when renting on the second-hand market?
First of all, if you find an ad on Facebook or on Blocket or on
what's Blocket?
Blocket is a marketplace in Sweden. That's essentially another agency for not only housing but also for it's like Craigslist. Is it called Craigslist?
Craigslist, exactly.
In the US,
yeah.
It's similar to that. So not only housing but cars, and then either like smaller objects like eBay, that type of that type of e-commerce as well.
Yeah.
But it's peer-to-peer essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
And sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So one needs to make sure already from the ad that there are no like red flags, meaning like if it's a bigger apartment in Uppsala central area and it costs only 5,000-6,000, then this is a warning sign.
shut it down.
One of the if it's that cheap for like a 80 square meter apartments, there is one needs to be careful if and to check if it's potentially a scam or not. Yeah.
And how would one check if it's a scam? Do you have any suggestions for that?
So if I go with that ad and contact the whoever posted the ad, and I can because I know that for internationals, if they don't speak or write in Swedish yet, then it's going to be in English. Then I think it's good to communicate first and see if they respond or not.
Yeah,
that's the first thing, because then if they respond, then we can ask if it's possible to have some pictures of the apartment, or if it's possible to schedule like a video chat to see the apartment
and the person, and make sure they're a real human person.
Yes. And then if you think, if you get the feeling that, okay, this might be real, then you can ask, say, to see the contract of, the potential contract of this the second-hand place, and then, if possible, the ID of the person renting out, and also if that person owns the place, if that person already obtained the permission to rent it out.
And where do they obtain permission from? So, yeah, thinking about if there's the difference between someone owning their apartment and someone renting their apartment, and then renting it out further.
Yeah. So it gets really complicated with second-hand contract, because it can be done via, so one doesn't necessarily need to own the apartment in order to rent it out. So for me, I can also rent it out to others, but one needs to fulfill like many different conditions. And that's the tricky part for internationals, because it's very difficult to know like what are the requirements. Then for say if someone owns the apartment and if they want to rent it out, then they need to obtain usually a written permission from their
bostadsrättsförening. Or the housing association,
this housing association that owns the building and owns the apartment, to get a written permission, because otherwise they are not legally allowed to rent it out.
And then that puts the tenant in a really tricky spot.
Yeah.
Should the housing association, or if it's a rental apartment, if they find out that the apartment has been rented to someone that's not been approved. I had a friend who had a really complicated situation with that, and it ended up costing him so much money to deal with it.
Exactly.
And so it's always good to make sure you have permission.
Exactly, yeah. And if it's from like a rental, then there will be other conditions that need to be fulfilled. It's usually concerning salary and how long the contract lasts. Yeah.
Right, and those are usually, I mean, there's a limited period for which people can rent an apartment secondhand with permission.
As well, yeah.
It's kind of maybe 2 years if you own the apartment, and 1 year if you rent the apartment.
Oh, I think it still depends on the specific landlord and the bostadsrättsförening and.
Okay, but basically, so it's just to check, but
to be careful,
and to know that there is a time limit, that it can't be sort of tills vidare for forever.
Yeah, because most of the options will be temporary, but then of course there are also long-term options, but it's fairly rare.
Right.
Yeah, fairly rare. I know it's a lot to like think about when finding or like looking for a place in Uppsala, and I think in the beginning it's pretty tricky to navigate the system, but on Uppsala International Hub's website, I think there's some information on how to navigate a first-hand contract, a second-hand contract, and even other options like a long-term stay, hotel and such. So I think it's good that there's some information in English and
it is a good resource, I think.
Online. Yeah.
And there we also have listed. So we talked a little bit about the municipal housing queue or the region housing queue, Uppsala bostadsförmedlingen.
Yeah.
But then there's also the possibility to sign up for queues with private rental companies.
Exactly.
So how I've understood that is that many of those companies put maybe 75% of their apartments on the Uppsala bostadsförmedlingen, and then save about 25%, approximately, for their own queues. And then often when you sign up for those separate private queues, they're often free, and they may have a shorter queue period.
Yeah, or if it's not a shorter queuing period, it can be they use another system. It can be first come, first serve.
Right.
Then what that means is that they will release apartments randomly. Then you have to be quick to respond to those ads in order to be accepted as one of the potential candidates. Yeah. Then they might also have some other requirements that need to fulfill. In order, they will give you the contract, but that's another way. Yeah.
If I could ask you to talk a little bit more about what are the different factors that affect pricing of apartments? Do you have some insight into that?
Yeah, so first of all, I would say first-hand contracts are usually cheaper than second-hand contracts if considering if they have the same apartment size and similar location. And there are some areas in the city center that are more attractive than the others, then they will of course cost more. And then there are some areas that are maybe 20-30 minutes away from city center, but it's more with closer to nature, then they might have a slightly higher price than the others as well. But it really depends on the location.
Right. Yeah. And are we talking 20 or 30 minutes cycling or by bus or?
Yeah. So Uppsala is a very bikeable city, and within the city center and a majority of the housing options, I would say it's doable by bike. But of course, if one doesn't have good bike skills like me during winter times, it's not advised.
It's a little bit of an extreme sport, isn't it?
Yeah, but then with public transportation, they go in Uppsala city and Uppsalakommun, they go pretty often, and that's not a problem if one lives a little bit far away from the city center or from their workplace. Yeah.
So then, I mean, that sounds logical, basically, that the apartments in city center are kind of closest to city center are a bit more expensive, and then kind of the further out you go, they can get a little less expensive.
Yeah.
But then if you get in one of these highly coveted areas that's really close to nature and, has maybe a villa or, a kind of freestanding apartment or house or that sort of thing, that you might be paying a bit more.
Exactly. So location matters. And then I think one also need to consider for utility cost. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, utility cost. That's what's not included in the housing contract. But then again, it really depends on the situation. So I can say about my current situation is that I pay. In my contract, my housing and my water usage, but not electricity and not internet or TV.
Right.
Yeah, and I know for some apartments, water is not included in the contract either.
Right.
So it's just the apartment that's included. So it really depends on what's written in the contract and what's.
So, I mean, if we sort of boil all of this down and summarize, what do you reckon are the best tips?
Yeah, I think first of all, for any internationals who want to move to Uppsala, they have to start early, really. If they have the opportunity to look up Uppsala bostadsförmedling and other websites, if they can sign up, please do so, because queuing points will already be accumulating as we speak now.
Yeah.
And the second thing is that to contact the future employers and see if they offer any relocation services, and if their future colleagues have any contacts that will give them maybe a second-hand contract.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So to reach out to some networks and also start early.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can jump in with a tip also, it would be to be flexible and to realize that you may not be able to find your dream apartment when you very first arrive, but to have a bit of an open mind of maybe living a little bit further outside of town. So we've talked about how bikeable Uppsala is. So even if you're a 10-minute bike ride from city center, you're actually still pretty centrally located. So to sort of keep that in mind, I think that's a good...
Yeah. Another tip that comes to mind is that if one is looking for a second-hand contract, they need to be very careful and see if it's a scam or not. Especially on Facebook, there have been occasions when people got scammed, and they sent deposits earlier to get before they can get a contract, and then they got scammed afterwards.
Yeah.
So do not send essentially any money before you have verified that first of all the apartment exists, and they have the permission to rent out the apartment, and then the person who is renting out, you have their information and ID to verify their identity.
Right.
Yeah.
And to sign a contract, or and that you see the contract.
You actually see the contract,
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
And make sure it doesn't say anything crazy, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think for people, and another tip would be to also maybe look for like a temporary housing here in the beginning, and then using their time to maybe look for a better place. Yeah, because many internationals have been here during their first few years, moving around multiple times. So that can happen as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So to use your networks and all of that.
Yeah, use the networks and everything. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like we've pretty well covered our personal experiences and the sort of general landscape of the housing market here. So with that, I'd like to really thank you for joining us today, Yunchen, and it's been great talking with you and learning from your experiences as well.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. So that wraps up the second edition of the Uppsala International Hub video podcast, and keep an eye out for upcoming events with the International Hub. And on our website, we also have a number of these tips and tricks and links to all of the different agencies that we've mentioned today. For example, Uppsala Bostadsförmedlingen, or the regional housing queue, is linked there, as well as some of the private housing queues that you can sign up for. So feel free to have a look at our website there. Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you next time.